In the autumn of 1887, in the vast windswept expanse of Dakota Territory, the settlers of Prairie Creek were engaged in their annual ritual of winter preparation. It was a rhythm dictated by the unforgiving sky, a series of tasks performed with the grim certainty of men and women who understood the stakes. They moved with a practiced economy, their motions honed by seasons of survival. They harvested the last of the root vegetables, packed them in straw-lined cellars, and slaughtered the hogs that would not be wintered over. Most importantly, they turned their attention to their homes, the thin wooden shells that stood between their families and the coming annihilation of the cold. They hammered loose boards, they replastered crumbling chimneys, and they diligently chinked the gaps between the logs of their cabins. Using a mixture of clay, mud, and tough prairie grass, they worked the sealant into every crack, a defense against the relentless wind that would soon shriek across the plains like a phantom army. Amidst this communal effort, one man's labor stood in stark, bewildering contrast. Lars Andersen, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived 2 years prior, seemed to be engaged in an act of profound foolishness. His log cabin, a sturdy and well-built structure by any standard, was already chinked and sealed. By all accounts, it was ready for winter. Yet Lars was not finished. Day after day, he worked not on his cabin, but over it. He was building a second structure, a strange arched skeleton that completely enveloped his home. He had spent weeks harvesting and steaming green ash saplings, bending them into enormous uniform curves. Now he was fastening these great wooden ribs to a frame that surrounded his cabin, creating what looked like the beginnings of a massive, elongated dome. His neighbors watched, first with curiosity, then with open mockery. Silas Croft, the owner of the general store and the self-appointed arbiter of local common sense, leaned against a hitching post and declared it for all to hear. "He's building a barn for his house," Croft announced, spitting a stream of tobacco juice for emphasis. "Must be expecting his cabin to have a calf." The laughter that followed was hearty and cruel. The sentiment spread through the small community like a grass fire. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. As Lars began sheathing the arched frame with rough sawn planks and then, even more bizarrely, with sheets of tar paper sealed with pine pitch, the name was born. They called it Andersen's Folly. The structure was an affront to their hard-won knowledge. It was inefficient, a waste of precious lumber and time that could be better spent cutting and stacking the massive cords of firewood a Dakota winter demanded. Their wisdom was simple and direct. When the cold came, you built a bigger fire. You did not, under any circumstances, build a house for your house. That winter, the mockery would freeze on their lips. A storm was gathering in the Arctic, a meteorological horror that would earn a name whispered in fear for generations, the schoolhouse blizzard of 1888. It would descend upon the territory with unimaginable speed and ferocity, a tidal wave of ice and wind that would kill hundreds. In the heart of that storm, as the conventional time-tested cabins of Prairie Creek became frigid tombs consuming fuel at a desperate pace, Andersen's Folly would become an ark of impossible warmth and stillness. The strange, wasteful structure would prove to be a work of quiet, unheeded genius. What did Lars Andersen, a quiet carpenter from a distant land, understand about the fundamental physics of heat, air, and survival that everyone else, the seasoned veterans of the prairie, dismissed as the ramblings of a fool? Lars Andersen's understanding was not born on the flat, featureless plains of Dakota. It was forged thousands of miles away, in the deep fjords and wind-battered coastline of central Norway, near the ancient city of Trondheim. There, survival was not a matter of brute force, but of elegant accommodation with the elements. The cold was a constant companion, but so was the sea, and the wisdom of his people was a tapestry woven from the threads of both. As a boy, he had not played on open fields, but in the bustling shipyards where his father and grandfather built fishing boats. These were not flimsy vessels. They were double-hulled marvels of engineering, designed to withstand the brutal chop of the North Sea. Lars had spent countless hours inside the skeletons of these ships, watching the craftsmen meticulously build the inner hull, then the outer, leaving a deliberate, carefully measured space between them. His grandfather, a man whose hands were maps of hard labor, had explained it simply. "The sea is cold, Lars," he had said, tapping the inner wall. "This keeps the fish from freezing. The air between is the true hull. It holds the boat afloat, and it holds the warmth in." This principle was everywhere in his homeland. He remembered the stabber, the traditional storehouse for food, which was always built on stout pillars of stone or wood. This elevated the structure, creating a space of open air between the floor and the frozen ground, preventing moisture and frost from seeping into the grain and cured meats. He saw it in the construction of the old sod-roofed homes, where thick layers of earth and turf provided a massive insulating blanket. The core idea was the same. The enemy was not the cold itself, but its movement. To stop the cold, you had to stop the air from moving. When Lars immigrated to America, this ingrained knowledge traveled with him. He spent a year in Chicago before venturing west, taking a grueling job in one of the city's massive commercial ice houses. It was here that the lessons of his childhood were solidified into scientific certainty. He saw how thousands of tons of ice, harvested from the frozen lake in winter, could be kept solid through the sweltering heat of a Midwestern summer. The secret was not in the thickness of the walls, but in their composition. The ice houses were built with two walls, a sturdy interior wall and an equally sturdy exterior one, with a gap of nearly 2 feet between them. This cavity was packed loosely with sawdust, a cheap and remarkably effective insulator. Lars, ever observant, understood the function. The sawdust was not the insulator. It was merely a medium to hold the true insulator. Millions of tiny pockets of trapped, unmoving air. Air, he realized, was the ultimate building material. It was weightless, it was free, and if held captive, it was a more powerful defense against heat transfer than the thickest oak plank. During his first winter in Dakota, he met an old Lakota man named Quonset-Covered, which meant savior, who came to the settlement to trade fine beaver pelts. While the other settlers bartered loudly, Lars noticed the old man's calm dignity and the profound intelligence in his eyes. Lars offered him a hot cup of coffee, and the two men sat in silence for a time, watching the wind whip snow across the frozen ground. Lars, through a series of gestures and the few words of Lakota he had learned, tried to ask about the man's winter lodge. Quonset-Covered understood. He pointed to Lars's single-walled cabin, then made a shivering motion. Then he gestured in a wide circle around himself, as if describing his own teepee, which Lars knew was a sophisticated structure of hide and poles, often with an inner liner. The old man brought his hands together, palms facing, but not touching. He held them still. Then he whispered a single word, "Tate Wiopeata," and made a gesture of stillness, of calm. Later, Lars would learn it meant something akin to a sacred space, protected from the wind. The Lakota elder, whose ancestors had survived millennia of these winters, had just confirmed the central principle of Lars's entire philosophy. It was not about fighting the wind, but about creating a zone of profound stillness that the wind could not penetrate. A blanket of dead air. To the other settlers, heat was a simple equation of combustion. Cold seeped in, so you burned more wood to drive it out. Their understanding was based on a direct, tactile relationship with the fire. But Lars Anderson, the shipbuilder's grandson and the icehouse worker, saw the invisible forces at play. He was thinking about thermodynamics. He understood that heat moves in 3 distinct ways, and a successful shelter had to defeat all of them. The first is conduction. the direct transfer of heat through a solid material. In a standard log cabin, the intense heat from the stove would conduct directly through the logs to the frigid air outside. The wood itself became a thermal bridge, a highway for heat to escape. Touching the inside wall of a cabin in winter felt cold for a reason. The wall was actively losing heat to the outside world. The second method is convection, the transfer of heat through the movement of fluids, like air or water. This was the most relentless enemy on the prairie. The wind, screaming at 60 miles per hour, was a convective engine of unimaginable power. It stripped heat from the outer walls of the cabins. Worse, it forced its way through 1,000 tiny, invisible cracks in the chinking, creating drafts. These drafts were not just uncomfortable, they were miniature rivers of cold air that initiated convective loops within the cabin itself. Hot air from the stove would rise to the ceiling, be cooled by the walls and drafts, and then sink to the floor, creating a perpetually cold zone near the ground, and forcing the stove to burn ever hotter to compensate. The large stone chimneys, a point of pride for many homesteaders, were massive convective pumps, sucking vast quantities of heated air out of the house along with the smoke. The third method is thermal radiation, the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves. Any warm object radiates heat to a colder object. A person sitting in a cabin was constantly radiating their own body heat toward the cold inner walls, the cold floor, and the cold windows. This is why one could feel a chill even in a room with a high air temperature. The body was losing its warmth to the surrounding cold surfaces. A single-wall cabin was a thermodynamic sieve, losing a battle on 3 fronts simultaneously. Lars's double-shelled design was a systematic counterattack against all 3. The vast, 24-inch gap of still air he was creating would all but eliminate conduction. Air is a terrible conductor of heat, and a thick layer of it was like a wall, made of nothing. The solid, tar-papered outer shell would stop the wind completely, defeating the primary convective force. It would take the full brunt of the prairie gale, leaving the air in the gap between the shells almost entirely undisturbed. This buffered zone of air would be cold, yes, but it would be still, and its temperature would be significantly higher than the ambient air outside. Finally, this system would combat radiation loss. A person inside the inner cabin would still radiate heat toward the inner walls, but those walls would now be radiating their heat toward a much warmer surface, the inner face of the outer shell, instead of directly to the deadly cold of the winter sky. The entire system was designed to insulate, not just with materials, but with a carefully engineered pocket of physics. The construction of this system was a masterclass in methodical patience. It began in the late summer, as soon as Lars had finished the initial cabin. While his neighbors were still harvesting, he was already in the wooded river bottoms, selecting young, straight ash trees. He felled them, stripped them of their branches, and hauled them back to his homestead. There he built a long, narrow steam box, a simple contraption of wood and canvas, fed by a pipe from a large iron kettle that sat constantly over a low fire. For days, the hiss of steam was a constant presence on his property. He would place the green saplings inside the box for hours until they were pliable as leather. Then, working quickly with a set of wooden forms he had built, he would bend the saplings into perfect, sweeping arches, clamping them in place to cool and set. This was a technique straight from the boatyards of his youth, a process that mystified his neighbors, who were accustomed to the straight lines and right angles of frontier carpentry. Once the arches were prepared, he laid a secondary foundation of flat field stones, creating a perimeter 2 feet wider on all sides than his cabin's footprint. Upon this, he built a low sill of heavy timbers. To this sill, and to a new secondary ridge beam, He constructed high above his cabin's existing roof peak. He began to affix the arches. He worked with a quiet precision that irritated the onlookers. Each arch was perfectly spaced, braced, and secured. The result was a ghostly, skeletal cage that dwarfed the cozy cabin within. Silas Croft made a special trip out to Lars's claim, ostensibly to deliver a sack of flour, but really to get a closer look at the madness. "Anderson," he said, shaking his head, "what in God's name is the point of the gap? It's just wasted space. You could have built your cabin twice as big for the same lumber." Lars paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at Croft, then at the space between the inner wall and the new outer frame. He offered only a quiet two-word rebuttal that was as incomprehensible to Croft as a foreign language. "Dead air," Lars said, and then turned back to his hammering. The sheathing process was even more laborious. He covered the entire arched framework with 1 by 6 inch planks of rough-sawn pine. He did not butt them tightly together. Instead, he left a small quarter-inch gap between each board, another detail that seemed sloppy and nonsensical to anyone watching. Over this planking, he applied the final skin, long, heavy strips of tar-impregnated felt paper. He overlapped each course by a full 6 inches, starting from the bottom and working his way up, just as a roofer would apply shingles. Every seam was meticulously sealed with a generous coating of hot pine pitch he rendered himself. The black, sticky substance coated his hands and clothes, and its sharp, resinous smell hung over his homestead for weeks. When he was done, the structure was a monolithic, windowless, black arch, curving from the ground on one side to the ground on the other, a stark and alien shape against the soft, rolling prairie. At the very peak of the arch and along the bottom edge near the foundation, he built small, operable vents, simple sliding wooden panels that could be opened in the summer to allow the air gap to breathe and prevent overheating, and sealed tightly in the winter to create his pocket of stillness. The final piece of the puzzle was the entrance. He didn't just build a door on the outer shell. He constructed a long, low tunnel, a sort of covered walkway that extended 10 feet from the outer wall. This tunnel had its own heavy door at the far end. To enter the home, one had to open this outer door, step into the unheated tunnel, close the door behind them, and only then proceed to the actual cabin door. Silas Croft laughed out loud when he saw it. He's built a gopher hole to his own front door. A man needs to be able to walk upright into his own home, not crawl in like a badger. Croft's arguments, delivered nightly to the patrons at his store, were always grounded in the received wisdom of the frontier. "A proper house needs a high ceiling," he would proclaim. "Gives the smoke and the bad air a place to go. Anderson's contraption squats right on top of his roof. It'll be a smoky, miserable place." He would tap his temple knowingly. The man's got boat madness, thinks he's building for a hurricane, not a blizzard. Here the solution is simple: a tight wall, a good stove, and a big woodpile. That's the Dakota way. Lars heard the whispers. He saw the smirks and the head shaking, but he did not engage. His confidence was not born of arrogance, but of calculation. He had spent his first 2 winters in a standard cabin, and he had kept meticulous records. He knew exactly how much wood it took to keep the temperature barely above freezing when the mercury plunged. He had measured the drafts with the smoke from a candle flame. He had felt the radiating cold from the walls on his own skin. His project was not a whim. It was a direct, engineered response to a problem he had studied with the dispassionate eye of a scientist. As he hammered the last nail and sealed the last seam, the first snows of the season were already beginning to fall. The mockery intensified, a final flurry of doubt before the long silence of winter set in. He ignored it all. He continued his work, his movements methodical, his purpose clear. He was not building for them. He was building for the wind, for the cold, and for the immutable laws of physics. The morning of January 12th, 1888, dawned with a deceptive mildness. A soft Chinook wind blew from the southwest, and the temperature, which had been brutally cold for weeks, rose to just above freezing. The snow on the ground began to melt, and children, released from the confinement of their cabins, went to their one-room schoolhouse in light coats. But in the northwest, a different reality was screaming down from the Canadian plains. An Arctic cold front of unprecedented power was moving at the speed of an express train, a wall of air 50 degrees colder than the air it was replacing. Around noon, without warning, the sky turned a sickening shade of gray-brown, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the front hit. The temperature plummeted not in hours, but in minutes. The gentle breeze was replaced by a sudden, violent roar, a wind that struck the buildings of Prairie Creek like a physical blow. The soft, melting snow instantly flash froze into a sheet of glass-thick ice, and the air filled with a blinding, choking storm of new snow, not flakes, but tiny, sharp crystals of ice driven horizontally at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to zero. The world vanished into a maelstrom of white noise and unimaginable cold. Inside Silas Croft's cabin, the change was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment his wife, Mary, was commenting on the pleasant thaw. The next, a blast of Arctic air slammed against the west wall with a sound like a freight train. The temperature inside the room dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. The chinking they had so carefully applied in the fall proved useless against the pressure of the gale. Icy drafts, sharp as knives, sliced through every tiny imperfection. The fire in their large, handsome stone fireplace, which had been lazily burning a few logs, suddenly roared to life as the wind created a powerful vacuum in the chimney. It began to consume wood with a frantic, insatiable hunger. Silas piled on more logs, but the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it was created. The vast majority of it was being sucked straight up the flue, a river of precious warmth flowing out into the blizzard. The cabin's single-log walls, which had felt solid and protective an hour before, were now conduits of cold. They leached warmth from the air, growing colder and colder to the touch until a fine layer of frost began to form on the inside, tracing the patterns of the wood grain in delicate, deadly filigree. The family huddled closer to the fire, but it was a losing battle. Their fronts roasted while their backs froze. The convective loop Lars Anderson had foreseen was now their reality. The super-chilled air from the walls and drafts sank to the floor, creating a layer of cold so profound that their feet, even in thick wool socks, felt numb. Mary clutched their 6-month-old son, Benjamin, wrapping him in every blanket they owned. But the infant's cries were becoming weak and listless. The greatest crisis, however, was outside. Their woodpile, a massive stack of oak and cottonwood that Silas had proudly proclaimed would last them until May, was located 30 yards from the cabin door. It was now completely invisible, buried under a rapidly growing snowdrift that was already taller than a man. To venture out into that white hurricane to find it was a suicide mission. They were trapped, with a finite supply of wood in the box by the hearth, in a house that was bleeding heat from every surface. A few hundred yards away, inside Anderson's Folly, the world was a different place. The sound of the storm was present, but it was muted, transformed from a high-pitched shriek into a deep, resonant rumble, like the sound of a distant ocean. The outer shell, the curved, tar-papered skin, took the full, kinetic fury of the wind. Its aerodynamic shape offered little purchase, and the main force of the gale was deflected up and over the structure. Snow did not pile up in a massive drift against a vertical wall. It scoured around the curved surfaces, leaving only a shallow, streamlined bank. The 24-inch air gap, the wasted space Silas Croft had mocked, was now a zone of profound, life-saving calm. The air within it was a buffer, a thermal moat. While the temperature on the outside of the shell plunged to 20 below zero, with a wind chill approaching 70 below, the temperature of the still air inside the gap was a comparatively mild 10 degrees above zero. It was a 30-degree difference created by nothing more than a pocket of air. Inside the inner cabin, the effect was astonishing. There were no drafts, not one. The air was still and quiet. The small cast-iron stove was not roaring. It was purring. Lars had the damper turned down low, and the wood inside was burning slowly, efficiently, releasing its energy in a steady, controlled wave of radiant and convective heat. The inner walls were not cold to the touch. They were cool, but they were not leaching warmth. They felt neutral, stable. The Arctic entryway had performed its function perfectly. The 10-foot tunnel had trapped the initial blast of cold, ensuring that when Lars had last come inside, not a single gust of the blizzard's fury had reached the inner sanctum. The family that had taken shelter with him, the Millers, whose own sod house was proving dangerously porous, sat in stunned silence. Their children, who had been shivering uncontrollably in their own home, were now sleeping peacefully under a single blanket. The atmosphere was not one of survival, it was one of domestic tranquility. Lars Anderson was not a man given to gloating or self-congratulation. He was a man of data. Periodically, he would rise and walk to the small mercury thermometer he had hung on the main wall of the cabin, far from the stove. He would read the temperature, a steady and unbelievable 62 degrees Fahrenheit, and make a small notation in a worn leather ledger. Next to the temperature, he would make a tick mark for every log he placed in the stove. He had been keeping this record all winter. He knew with empirical certainty that he was using less than a third of the wood his neighbors were. He would then perform a small test, a habit born of his scientific curiosity. He would light a thin sliver of wood, blow it out, and watch the trail of smoke. He carried the smoldering splinter to the windows, to the door frame, to the corners of the room. The smoke rose in a perfectly straight, undisturbed vertical line. There were no drafts. His house was a sealed vessel of warmth and calm in the heart of a frozen hell. This was not luck. This was engineering. By the second day of the blizzard, the situation at the Croft cabin had become desperate. They had burned through the wood in the box, then the wooden crate it was in. They had broken up a spare chair and fed it to the fire, piece by piece. The temperature in the room, even with the fire blazing, had dropped into the 40s, and away from the hearth, it was near freezing. Little Benjamin was now frighteningly quiet, his breathing shallow. Mary's face was a mask of terror. Silas knew he had to do something. The thought of going to Anderson, the man he had ridiculed for months, was a bitter pill. But the image of his son, pale and still, overrode his pride. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, tied a rope around his waist, and secured the other end to his doorknob, and plunged into the storm. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore the breath from his lungs. The cold was a physical pain, burning his exposed skin instantly. He could not see his own feet. He navigated by pure instinct, keeping the roaring wind, which he knew was from the northwest, on his right cheek. He fell a dozen times, crawling on hands and knees over the frozen, sastrugi-carved snow. What should have been a 2-minute walk took him the better part of an hour. He nearly missed the dark shape of Anderson's Folly entirely, stumbling upon its curved wall by sheer chance. He clawed his way along the structure until he found the opening to the tunnel and collapsed through the outer door. For a moment, he lay in the relative quiet of the Arctic entryway, gasping, his body shaking uncontrollably. Then, the inner door opened, and Lars Anderson stood there, silhouetted by the warm, yellow lamplight from within. Lars took in the sight of the ice-caked, desperate man without a word. There was no "I told you so" in his eyes, no hint of triumph. There was only a quiet, immediate understanding of the crisis. He helped Silas inside, sat him down, and gave him a cup of hot coffee. As the warmth began to seep back into his frozen limbs, Silas looked around the cabin in utter disbelief. He saw the sleeping Miller children, the small, quiet stove, the calm, comfortable air. He saw the thermometer on the wall and stared at its reading, his mind unable to process the number. It was warmer in here than his own home had been on a mild autumn day. His pride finally shattered, replaced by a wave of crushing fear for his family. "My boy," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "He's so cold. We've run out of wood." Lars simply nodded. He put on his own heavy coat, grabbed a coil of rope and a canvas sled, and together, the two men plunged back into the storm. They brought Mary and the baby back, a perilous journey that nearly claimed them all. When Mary entered the cabin, clutching her child, and felt the wave of stable, gentle warmth, she burst into tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Over the next 12 hours, 2 more families from the most exposed homesteads made their way to the strange black dome, guided by the steady, unwavering plume of smoke from its chimney, a beacon of efficiency in a storm that had extinguished so many weaker fires. Lars Anderson's small cabin became a crowded refuge, sheltering 17 people. He shared his food, his blankets, and his life-saving warmth without hesitation. His grace was as profound as his foresight. Silas Croft sat on a stool near the wall holding his son, who was now stirring and beginning to regain his color. He watched Lars tend the stove, adding a single, small log, only when necessary. He felt the wall behind him. It was not radiating cold. He could see his own breath in his cabin. Here, the air was clear. The questions that had been born of mockery were now reborn of genuine, humbled curiosity. He finally walked over to Lars. "The gap," Silas said, his voice quiet. "The air. How did you know?" Lars looked up from the stove. He pointed to the ceiling, then made a gesture with his hands, like a bird settling its feathers. "In Norway," he said simply, "we learned to wear a good coat. A house is the same. The wind cannot steal the heat if it cannot touch the wall. The still air is the coat." When the blizzard finally broke on the morning of the 14th, the world it revealed was silent, white, and alien. The landscape had been reshaped by the storm, with drifts burying entire sheds and fences. The human cost across the territory was devastating, but in Prairie Creek, thanks to one man's foresight, everyone had survived. A week later, after the community had dug itself out and counted its losses in livestock and property, a small, somber delegation of men appeared at Lars Anderson's door. Silas Croft was at their head. There were no apologies offered. On the prairie, actions spoke louder than words. "Anderson," Croft began, holding his hat in his hands, "we need you to show us. Show us how you built it." Lars spent the entire afternoon with them. He did not lecture. He demonstrated. He took them outside and walked them around the structure, explaining the function of every component. He used a stick to draw diagrams in the snow, showing how he had bent the arches, how he had spaced the sheathing, how he had lapped the tar paper. He explained the purpose of the Arctic entryway and the vents for summer cooling. They listened with the rapt attention of students who had survived a near-fatal examination. They asked quiet, technical questions. What kind of wood for the arches? How wide is the gap exactly? How do you seal the seams against the pitch? Lars answered every question patiently and thoroughly. He was not giving away a secret. He was sharing a principle. He was teaching them the grammar of a language of survival he had learned long ago. That summer, the sounds of construction echoed across Prairie Creek, but it was a new kind of building. At least 6 families, led by Silas Croft, undertook the laborious process of retrofitting their homes with what they now called Anderson's air jacket. They built the outer shells around their existing cabins, mimicking Lars's design as best they could. Their versions were often cruder, the arches less uniform, the tar paper applied with less precision, but they adhered to the fundamental concept, the creation of a substantial, sealed air gap. Silas, driven by the memory of his son's pale face, built the most impressive replica, becoming the system's most fervent evangelist. When newcomers arrived, ignorant of the Follies' history, and questioned the strange appearance of the covered cabins, it was Silas Croft who would explain, with the zeal of a convert, the physics of dead air and the genius of the quiet Norwegian. The following winter was a cold one. Though it lacked a storm of the 1888 blizzard's ferocity, the results were undeniable. Families reported burning between 1/2 and 2/3 less wood than in previous years. Their cabins were not just survivable, they were comfortable. The doctor who served the county noted a dramatic drop in cases of pneumonia and frostbite from the Prairie Creek settlement. Babies born that year thrived, and the community's elderly made it through to the spring with their health intact. The air-jacketed cabins became a symbol of prudence and success, a visible sign that the owner was a person who planned for the worst and understood the true nature of the prairie winter. The innovation, born of tradition and observation, had been proven not in theory, but in the crucible of survival, and was now woven into the fabric of the community's life. The story of Anderson's Folly might have remained a piece of local lore, had it not been for the curious and observant schoolteacher, Miss Evelyn Reed. She had watched the entire saga unfold, from the initial mockery to the final quiet vindication. Fascinated by the scientific principles at play, she had taken copious notes and made detailed sketches of Lars's design. In the spring of 1889, she wrote a long, articulate letter to her brother, an architectural engineer in Minneapolis. She described the brutal failure of the conventional cabins during the Great Blizzard and the astonishing success of Lars's double-walled, air-insulated dwelling. Her brother, intrigued, shared the letter with his colleagues at the University of Minnesota. A professor of thermodynamics saw in the simple, hand-built structure a perfect practical application of his field's core tenets. A small article titled "A Norwegian Method for Prairie Wintering" was eventually published in a regional agricultural and engineering journal. It was a dry, academic piece, but it entered Lars Anderson's quiet innovation into the permanent record, a footnote in the larger history of how settlers learned to adapt and survive in one of the world's harshest climates. Decades later, the emerging field of modern building science would formally validate every single one of Lars's intuitive choices. His outer shell would be given a name, a wind barrier, and a rain screen. The inner cabin was the conditioned envelope. The Arctic entryway was a textbook example of an airlock vestibule, a critical feature for minimizing air exchange in extreme climates. The carefully engineered air gap was, in modern parlance, a super-insulated wall assembly. Scientists could now calculate its effectiveness, assigning it an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, so high that it would dwarf the insulating properties of solid logs or even the sawdust-filled walls of the Chicago Ice House. Lars Anderson had, with hand tools and practical wisdom, built a high-performance home that functioned on the same principles as a thermos bottle or a double-pane window. He had created a structure that did not merely withstand the cold, but intelligently disarmed it. The tale of Anderson's Folly is more than just the story of a clever design. It stands as a parable of the clash between conventional wisdom and empirical truth, between brute force and elegant efficiency. The settlers of Prairie Creek believed the answer to the cold was a bigger fire, an approach of direct and costly opposition. Lars Anderson, drawing on ancestral knowledge and his own quiet observations, understood that the most powerful force is often the one that is yielded to and redirected. He saw that the most effective shield against the fury of the wind was a zone of engineered stillness. He recognized a profound truth of the prairie, that in a land of scarcity, survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most efficient. In the heart of the unforgiving plains, where the wind and cold were relentless sovereigns, Lars Anderson did not declare war on winter. He did not try to defeat it with a larger army of firewood or a thicker fortress of logs. Instead, he simply taught his home how to wear a thicker coat, a coat woven from the one material the prairie offered in infinite and inexhaustible supply, the air itself.